Today I'll show you how to make a delicious loaf of cranberry pecan sourdough bread. It's perfect for the winter, or really any time that you're craving a substantial, nutty, hearty loaf of sourdough. Here's how to make it. Start by taking your leftover sourdough starter out of the fridge. I've got about 25 grams of leftover sourdough starter in this jar. For the feeding, add 50 grams of water to your sourdough starter, then just mix that around just to dissolve the starter into the water. And then add 50 grams of bread flour. This is just the same brand of bread flour that I'll be using for my bread. And then stir all of that together until you've got a pancake batter-like consistency. Then mark the top of your sourdough starter with a rubber band so you can see how much it grows, and let it sit out on your counter overnight or for about 6 to 8 hours until it looks something like this. With this style of feeding, it usually takes my sourdough starter just about 7 or 8 hours to double, and it's ready to use. To mix your dough, get out a digital scale and a mixing bowl. Add to that 325 grams of water, and then add 10 grams of salt. I use kosher salt, but any kind of plain sea salt or table salt will be fine as well. And then add 100 grams of your risen and doubled sourdough starter, which should now be bubbly and active and ready to use. And if you're following the same feeding schedule as I am, we started with 25 grams of leftover sourdough starter, added 50 grams of water, 50 grams of flour. So since we're using 100 grams of sourdough starter for this bread, we should be left with 25 grams of sourdough starter left in the jar at the end of this. You could just pop that starter back in the fridge and save it for the next time you want to bake. If you're interested in learning more about my no discard sourdough starter maintenance routine, I'll link to a video that I made earlier about that same topic. Watch that video after this one. It really is possible never to throw away any of your sourdough starter. Well, now that I covered that, go ahead and stir your starter and salt into the water, just enough to dissolve them a little bit. It'll make it easier to incorporate that into the dough later. Whenever those are stirred to your liking, go ahead and add to the bowl 450 grams of plain white bread flour. I'm using the blue bag of King Arthur bread flour. It's what I generally use for sourdough recipes like this. Bring the dough together with a spoon or a dough whisk or some kind of instrument that you like to stir with until all of the dry bits of flour have dissolved into the dough and the dough starts to hold together. Once you've got a shaggy dough that holds together pretty well like this, it's time to let the dough rest. Simply cover up the dough with a kitchen towel and let it rest on the counter for 30 minutes at room temperature. During those 30 minutes, the flour in the dough will hydrate and the dough will hold together a lot better than if you didn't let the dough rest. You might be wondering when I'm going to add the cranberries and pecans. Well, I'm going to do that later after one set of stretch and folds. So take your dough, stretch one end of it up into the air, and fold it over the top. Then grab the next edge of dough, stretch it up into the air, and fold it over the top. Do this a third time and a fourth time until you've stretched all four corners of the dough. Now cover up the dough again with the kitchen towel and let it rest for 30 more minutes. After this 30-minute rest, you'll begin adding the cranberries and pecans. So a half hour later, take the cover off the dough, and the dough should now be a lot stronger after that first set of stretch and folds, which is a lot better for incorporating things like fruit and nuts. Speaking of which, get out one standard bag of cranberries, 170 grams, and then 130 grams of chopped pecans. In total, that's 300 grams of inclusions that you're going to be adding into your dough, which for one loaf like this, I think is the perfect amount. It's not too much, and it's not too little. Weigh your ingredients with a digital scale just to make sure you're getting the right amount. And then if you accidentally add too many pecans to the bowl, definitely put those back in the bowl for next time. Just kidding, you can eat them. Mix the two inclusions together thoroughly in the bowl, and then they're ready to add to your dough. To add the cranberries and pecans to the dough, I like to add them in two stages. Half of the inclusions now, then rest for 30 minutes, and then the other half of the inclusions later. So with your dough uncovered, dimple down the dough with your fingertips just to make a flat surface, and then add half of the pecan and cranberry mixture on top of the dough. You don't really have to weigh out half of the mixture exactly, I just usually eyeball it and it's completely fine. Once half of the inclusions are on top of the dough, press them down with your fingertips so that they stick to the moist dough. You're going to be stretching and folding the dough in order to incorporate the inclusions, so if you don't press the inclusions into the dough now so that they stick, they're going to end up falling all over the place when you try to do the stretch and folds. So make sure they stick. Now it's time for the second set of stretch and folds. This one is going to be just like you did the first time, except you're going to be doing it a little more gently so you can incorporate the layers of pecans and cranberries as you stretch and fold. So stretch one end of the dough up and fold it over the top, then take the next edge of dough, stretch it up in the air and fold it over the top of the dough and try to stick it to the other edge of the dough. Then grab the third edge of dough, stretch it up in the air and fold it over. See how I just kind of press it down to stick against the other dough. And then grab the last edge of dough, stretch it up in the air, and fold it over the top so that it sticks to the other dough. Now you've got layer upon layer of cranberries and pecans folded throughout your dough. At this point, cover up the dough with a kitchen towel once again and let it rest for another 30 minutes at room temperature. 30 minutes later, uncover the dough, and it's time to add the rest of the cranberries and pecans and perform the third and final set of stretch and folds to incorporate them. So flatten the dough a little bit with your fingertips, and then pour in the rest of the cranberries and pecans. Press those down so that they stick to the dough as well. Same thing, you don't want those to fall when you're doing the stretching and folding. Then do one last set of stretch and folds, just like the previous one, to incorporate the remainder of the fillings. The only difference this time is that the dough is going to be a lot more delicate because it's full of fruit and nuts, so make sure you're being very gentle in the stretching and folding process this time because you don't want to rip the dough. If you're a little too forceful at this point, you might rip the dough and then it's just harder to bring it back together. Not impossible, but it's more difficult, so be extra gentle on these last stretches and folds. Once everything is brought together, you've got now about like 6 million layers of cranberries and pecans layered throughout this dough. I don't even know how many layers it is, but you've got a bunch. And if you properly built strength into the dough with the first set of stretch and folds, the dough should hold together when you pick it up like this. It shouldn't fall apart at all at this point. So now your dough is ready for the first rise or bulk fermentation. I prefer to do the bulk fermentation in a clear-sided glass container like this. It allows me to watch how much the dough is rising over time. It's not necessary, but it's just something I prefer. So if you've got a glass bowl like this, go ahead and grease it with just a little bit of oil, and then carefully lift the dough out of the mixing bowl and flip it over into the glass bowl so that the seam side is facing down and the smoother side is on top. Then place the airtight lid or a sheet of plastic wrap on top of the bowl. This will keep moisture in the dough so that the top of the dough doesn't dry out, which isn't the end of the world, but it's always really sad when it happens. So once the dough is covered up, it's time to bulk ferment. Let the dough sit at room temperature for about 8 to 12 hours to rise. This might seem like an extra long amount of time, and it is. It took my dough exactly 12 hours to rise to double in size because of all those nuts and fruit that are weighing it down. So a little extra time is called for here. Whenever your dough has significantly risen or about doubled in size, take off the lid and carefully remove the dough from the bowl. Just place the dough directly onto your counter. You don't need to add any flour to the counter. Place it on the counter with the seam side down and the smooth side facing up. Now it's time to give the dough a pre-shape. Even though I'll be shaping this loaf as an oval later for its final shape, right now I'm pre-shaping it into a round ball. This will give the dough some initial structure and it'll create tension across the top of the loaf. That's exactly what you're looking for. After the pre-shape, let the dough rest on the counter uncovered for 30 minutes. Once the dough has rested for 30 minutes uncovered, that creates a nice little drier skin on top of the dough that will help you in the final shape. Speaking of which, now it's time to shape the loaf into an oval or a batard shape. Start by sprinkling a little bit of bread flour on top of the dough just to create an extra non-stick surface. Rub the flour into the dough, and then sprinkle flour all around an oval-shaped Banneton basket. My Banneton basket is 10 inches in size, and I'll include a link down below in the video description to all the tools that I recommend. Once your Banneton basket is prepared, this is a really easy, simplified way to shape your loaf into an oval. Take the dough up in your hands and flip it over so the sticky side, the underside, is now facing up. And then just fold the loaf together gently, just like you're closing a book and sticking the dough into itself like this. Try not to knock all the air out of the dough, but you're just closing it gently. Then give the dough a quarter turn and then close the book once again, sticking the dough into itself one more time. This might seem a little counterintuitive to fold the dough twice like this. Why wouldn't I just fold it once and make an oval shape? Well, this way creates tension across the dough in two different directions. I think it gives the dough a little bit more structure, and overall it just works, so I'm fine with it. Then pinch the seam of your dough closed with your fingertips, then pick the dough up with your hands and place it gently into that Banneton basket with the flour side facing down and the sticky side facing up, so the dough is essentially upside down to how you're going to be baking it. If the seam of the dough starts to open up again, you can pinch it closed with your fingertips again just to seal it. And now your dough is ready for the second rise or the final proof. You can see here the Banneton basket and the dough were properly prepared, so the dough is not sticking to the Banneton basket. For the final proof, you have two options. You can cover up your dough with a kitchen towel and let it sit at room temperature for about 2 to 3 hours and then bake it. Or you can do a cold overnight proof in the fridge, which is what I'm going to do. For the cold proof, simply cover up your dough with a kitchen towel and then move it to your fridge. Let it sit and rise in your fridge anywhere from 8 to 24 hours. pretty much until whenever you're ready to bake it the next day. Then the next day, 30 minutes before you're ready to bake, preheat your oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit. And during those 30 minutes, remember to have your baking vessel or your Dutch oven preheating on the middle rack of your American oven, or wherever your oven's from. Then when your oven's preheated, pull your dough out of the fridge and it's ready to bake. If you've done the overnight cold proof in the fridge, your dough should be nice and stiff, which will actually make it easier to score the dough and handle the dough later, which is a good thing. So to score your dough, get a piece of parchment paper that's a little bit bigger than your Banneton basket, place it on top of the dough, which is actually the bottom of the dough. Flip the dough over so it's right side up, and gently coax it out of the Banneton basket. Then if there's a little bit of excess flour on top of the dough, brush it off or just brush it into the dough itself. That'll create a little extra contrast when you score the dough. It'll burst open in the oven along the score marks, creating a white to brown contrast, which is pretty cool. So carefully holding a razor blade or using a bread lame, hold the blade at a shallow angle and give the loaf 3 cuts just like this. I like to do 3 cuts on this loaf rather than one long one because I've noticed that loaves that contain a lot of nuts are a little bit more difficult to do the one long slash method. That's why I like the 3 slashes. Plus the loaf looks pretty interesting and attractive when it bursts open along these score marks. But no matter how you slash the loaf, once you've scored it, it's time to bake it. Pick up the loaf, parchment paper and all, and transfer it into your hot Dutch oven. Place the lid back on the Dutch oven to trap the steam, and bake this loaf for an initial 20 minutes at 450 degrees Fahrenheit. After 20 minutes, remove the Dutch oven lid to release the steam and admire your oven spring. Then bake this loaf for an additional 35 minutes at 450 degrees Fahrenheit. It's an extra long baking time for this loaf because of how much is just stuffed into this loaf. It needs a little more time to bake and get a proper brown crust. After a total of 50 to 55 minutes of baking, your loaf should look something like this: golden brown, crusty, and bursting with fillings. Before slicing into your loaf, let it cool on a cooling rack, or if you can't find yours, directly on top of your stove. Let it cool for 1 hour before slicing in so it's not gummy on the inside. After an hour, my loaf looks like this, and I'm ready to taste test. Slice into your loaf with a serrated knife to reveal the beautiful crumb shot of cranberries, pecans, just completely spread throughout that loaf because of all those stretching and foldings you did in order to incorporate the inclusions. I think 300 grams of inclusions was the exact perfect amount for this loaf. Not only does it look really good, but the flavor and texture was perfect too. One slice of this bread is perfectly crunchy from the right amount of pecans, and those dried cranberries, when they bake up in the bread, become tangy, juicy, and just delicious. And of course, a slather of butter spread onto this bread is the perfect way to enjoy it. While I love the tanginess that the cranberries bring to this loaf, my absolute favorite part of the flavor of this bread is the nuts. The pecans, it would be just cliche to call them nutty tasting, but they really are nutty in the best way possible. When the pecans bake up in this loaf of bread, they become roasty, toasty, nutty, and delicious. They almost have a savory element to them, but they remain balanced and sweet because of the cranberries, and they're just overall filling, scrumptious, and delicious. I don't know how else to describe it. They're nutty and great. You need to give this cranberry pecan sourdough bread a try. There's a link to the recipe down in the video description.